Well, thank you. My name is Matagi Sorensen. I'm from the Yavapai Apache Nation in northern Arizona. I um, I grew up kind of traveling around. Really, my family sold things, and so we spent time in just different parts of the Southwest, depending on where the tourism market was at that time, and lived in motel rooms and camped a lot. I had never went to school until I was 24, and so it was a really unusual childhood. One of the things that I really looked forward to and that meant so much to me when I was growing up was going back home to my mom's reservation, the Yavapai Apache reservation, and my grandmother, my great grandmother, I should say, we always called her Big Sister, is an Apache. That's what your great grandmother is. Uh, was she was just this very solid rock, there, and so she was a basket weaver, and I remember sitting there and watching her weave, and her house would always smell like acorn. She'd cook acorn stew all the time and smell like tortillas, and it was just it was a sanctuary and this kind of upheaval that I lived in constantly, and it really meant a lot. So a lot of my work today, really calls back to that time period, and I know that a lot of people, we work through our childhood and so forth, and a lot of our artwork, kind of deals with what our experiences are. But mine isn't so much about that as it's more about the material use. The way I see the materials being used, and the my time on the road. And how my family, the five of us, would collect materials on the side of the road and reshape them and grind them down and cut them and polish them. And my dad would sell them to shops for maybe 50 cents, but you do 200 of them and you get through on that just enough for a few days to live on and then do it all over again. And so when I work today, I really have that intensity about my work and how I work. I really push myself hard, but at the same time, I'm always looking at material and what I can kind of draw from it, whether it's the actual material itself or whether it's just looking about how it grows. And I think that kind of inspires a lot of who I am. Is that those two big elements of my life really shaped a lot. I'm a parent. I've been a single parent for 15 years now. My daughter turns 18 next month, and I've slowly been sharing this stuff with her and really trying hard not to bombard her with what I do, where she feels like she has to follow along the same path, but trying to open those doors for her so she understands the type of artwork I do and how it's an option for her to go that path if she wanted to. So when thinking about, like, I guess what I'm doing for somebody outside of myself, I think about her a lot, of like, how am I cultivating that creative bug that she might have, or how am I helping her feel secure about her life and her choices, through what I do, and all the times that she watches me there, and through our time period that we've had this last 8 months, I guess it's been now since COVID started. Me and her are very close. We're in the same space, and how does that affect her to see me run through these different challenges I have of working and problem solving through techniques of going from a large studio space to working in my apartment, in the kitchen. It's a very challenging thing to do, and so it's been a lot of problem solving, and just kind of watching her engage with me on that level has been really interesting, and has kind of changed the trajectory of what I'm doing and how I look at it. How has my culture melded with my inspiration? You know, my family is my culture, and I think that's something that's really important to for me to talk about a lot is sometimes culture can be looked at as something that's separate from family, but it's not. You, your family really is your culture. So what I mean is the times I spent with my great grandmother, my big sister, or the times I spent back home with my mom and with my grandmother and the people who are still there, that is what we are. That is our culture. And the Yavapai Apache is very, we're a very small tribe. There's about a little over 3,000, maybe around 3,500 members, and we're scattered all around. We're in a small reservation. So what we have is we have each other and our families and who our families are connected to and our stories and our traditions, which really fall in where we live. So the materials that we collect has to do with what's right around us, what's in this kind of what materials grew in our traditional homelands, and that is us. And we don't do a lot of we have ceremonies and so forth, but we don't do a lot of those anymore. We don't have enough members to do that, and we don't have enough reservation land to really create these large festivals. And so I think that our culture is very much, when I think of it for me personally, and I can't speak for everybody in our tribe, but when I think of it for me personally, it's my clan, it's the people that I grew up around, and it's the people that I engage with. That's who my culture is. And how it inspires me is the conversations I have, the way I engage with the land there, the materials that I use in my work, or the materials I get ideas from, knowing the traditional uses for those materials, how they're used in baskets or different plants that we'll eat. There's pieces that I do that revolve around how an acorn looks and things. So there's a lot of representation that I pull from our materials that we have. And when our stories come into it, I'm very, very careful to never bring those up, because our stories are sacred to us. They're meant for us. They're not meant for a larger audience. And for years, I worked for the tribe and I lectured on who we are. And that conversation came up a lot of like ceremonies and sacred stories. And never once have I ever shared that, because it's not meant for somebody who's outside of our nation or outside of our tribe to hear. It's something I feel very firm about, is that you don't share what's sacred. And so in my artwork, if I am not sure if something's sacred or not, I won't share it. So I try to stick very much to things that are okay to share with general public. I think there's something really interesting about that. So I'm a grad student at ASU. I got my metalsmithing degree at NAU 10 years ago for a Bachelor's of Fine Arts. And I started after 10 years of having my own studio. I started ASU 2 years ago. And so I had a studio here at ASU, which I'm in today. So when that closed, I had to start working differently. But one of the really fortunate things about being a grad student is the people you're exposed to and how they work, and people from all over the world. And so I was watching how other people were working with some of the materials and so forth. And I was able to kind of latch onto that a little bit, to really look at what I'm doing and thinking, well, I really don't have to work with silver and gold and diamonds and so forth, which is the usual materials I work with, which are not traditional. For my tribe, we're basket weavers and beading, and so that's what we do. I've used a lot of those techniques as ideas to create jewelry pieces from, but I hadn't tried to really work with the material before. And I was inspired seeing people around the world work in different ways. And so I started spending the time that I would have been working in the studio, creating stuff for shows and so forth. I started spending that time traveling and going back home and going to the mountains and trying to find materials that I could weave into my pieces. One of the plants that I use a lot is there's an Apache word for it. I'm not great at pronouncing it, so I'm not going to try. The term commonly used is called the devil's claw, and it's the black part of an Apache basket. So when I was a kid, I always thought these were great plants. They're really cool looking. And I've been inspired by them for a while, and I've made a lot of representative pieces of jewelry based on it. But at this time, because of where we're at and because of working in such a small space, I decided to start using the material itself and seeing how that would hold up. And I think there is a challenge for me coming from a very strict jewelry profession to working with material that's organic and won't hold up to time. It challenges me a little bit to change the way I think of jewelry as being something that should last 1,000 years to something that I know may not last that long. So there is that challenge, but I think sometimes it means more for the sake of the art to do something that is interesting and new compared to something that is sellable and something I know I can sell and that will hold up. So that's what I was really wrestling with a lot, was those things. And so I started collecting a bunch of this material. And so what I was doing is working them into silver jewelry and figuring out how to inlay that material right into the jewelry. So it's something I'll be a work in progress. I'll have a thesis show in a year, and hopefully I'll use a lot of that work in there. That's the direction I went a lot during this time, was going back to finding these traditional materials, and instead of doing representational work of it in silver, of trying to use the actual plant life in the pieces. And I think that will change a lot in how I work, and will probably change kind of my future trajectory too on how I look at things and engage with the environment in a different way. Some of the other things I think that I started paying a lot more attention to over COVID that I hadn't done before was really producing a lot of drawings and things that I'm not a sketcher, but really producing a lot of drawings that are really detailed drawings of the plants and how they grow. And that's something I feel like I really overlooked before, of trying to break down the systems inside the plant life to see how it's working, and trying to understand that to see how I can utilize that in my craft. So some of the pieces I've been doing is I was creating these little furnaces. So one of the challenges with working in a small space is, how do I use a torch? And how can I solder, and how can I do all these things I'm familiar with doing? So I started making these little furnaces, and I can plug torches into them and heat them up. They're just basically fire bricks. So and from there, I would take blocks of metal and forge it. And so these pieces here were some forged bracelets I did. And I'll send some pictures of these too that are a little better. But those I was pretty excited about, and they're really based once again on plants that hook. So the devil's claw I showed earlier is like a plant that hooks on. That's how it spreads its seed. And so I was looking at that when I say the function of what a plant does. I was looking at that and thinking of, like, if I was to use that idea, how would I do that? And so making these pieces that maybe aren't so wearable, but have some of the purpose behind them. And forging is something that I hadn't taken the time to do before, and I really wanted to learn how to do. Although a lot of the forging I did had to be outside in the desert, bringing my anvil out there with my little furnace that I made, or what would you call forge, and sitting out there and just hammering and shaping the metal. So I feel like this time for me, these last 8 months, has been really hard and really good at the same time. It's hard for so many reasons, of not really getting feedback from that I usually would get when I travel with my work, but also watching how and it's really sad. But watching how the tribes around us are dealing with COVID, and like my tribe personally, like how things, I hope they're not, but they sure feel like they're falling apart. And it's really, really sad. It's extremely sad. And I think what's so hard is that, our elders are the most vulnerable right now. And our elders are who are the people who still remember a lot of the stories and have know the names of mountains and know all of these things that are so hard to learn. It's so hard to spend the time and to be there every day and to really hear all this stuff and remember that and carry it on. That I'm really questioning what is my role in uh, what is my role to be able to carry on some of this stuff, and how does that work? Like, how can I address that? And being in a very academic environment, I think of learning as this kind of way of like looking at things and doing it and writing it down. But that's not really the way it is with those things. It's really about being around somebody. It's about, you know, being there in that place and hearing those stories as you're working or whatever it is you're doing or collecting material, or anything. It's just being around it and hearing those stories. And I've always thought that I've had more time to do that. But now I really question that, because these things can happen where they can really decimate our numbers and really change how we like engage with each other. And the idea of like not being able to go home for Thanksgiving or Christmas or celebrate my daughter's birthday with my family when she turns 18 is really hard to think about. So I really hope when we emerge from this um, that we emerge fairly intact. But I'm very concerned about that too. So as much as I'm growing as an artist, and this time has been a time where I've been able to slow down and really look at what I'm doing, and I feel like that's really nice. And I've been able to spend a lot of time with my daughter. I feel kind of this great sense of guilt for not being back home and doing more there. And I think that's something I'm probably always going to wrestle with a little bit of, like, what is my role within my tribe, and what is my role as a parent or as a person too, and how do those things all fit together? Um, and being an artist and traveling is something that is really important to me. But also, I'm looking at, should I run for office at home, and should I try to do a lot more there to try to work within that community and try to stabilize or help be a person who helps to stabilize that, so we have some things in place for if something like this happens again. But also just in general, like, how are we taking care of our other members and the people who can't work and the people who are the holders of knowledge and so forth? Like, how are we taking care of them, and how are we preserving our traditions and our language and everything? So there's a lot of kind of heaviness right now, I think, too, in regards to all of that I feel. Well, thank you for having me. This is it's been really wonderful to partake in this interview, and yeah, thank you.